After years studying exercise scientists, I was wrong about health. Not wrong in some small, forgivable way. Wrong about the entire hierarchy I'd built my understanding of health around. I used to think health was mostly about what you eat, with exercise as a supporting character, something you did to burn off the extra calories or to look a certain way. After years of conversations with the people who actually study human physiology for a living, I've come to believe that's almost backwards. The single strongest predictor of how long and how well you're likely to live isn't your diet, it isn't your weight, it's your physical capacity, and almost nobody is talking about it the way the evidence actually suggests we should be. I want to walk you through exactly how this unfolded for me, because it wasn't one conversation. It was a slow, uncomfortable dismantling of assumptions I'd never actually examined across dozens of conversations with exercise physiologists, cardiologists, and longevity researchers, each one chipping away at a picture of health I'd absorbed from culture rather than from evidence. Let me start with the fact that reframed everything, because I think it's the single most underappreciated number in all of preventive medicine. There's a measurement called cardiorespiratory fitness, often expressed as VO2 max, which is essentially a measure of how efficiently your body can take in and use oxygen during intense physical effort. Multiple researchers described the same striking finding to me. Across an enormous number of large, long-term studies, cardiorespiratory fitness has emerged as one of the single strongest predictors of all-cause mortality that exists in medicine. In some analyses, a stronger predictor than smoking status, than diabetes, than high blood pressure, than obesity. I remember sitting with that fact for a long time because I had spent years assuming those other, more commonly discussed risk factors were the real story, and fitness itself was a secondary supporting consideration. What the actual data suggests is closer to the opposite. Your fitness level appears to modulate the risk from almost every other major health condition, in some cases dramatically, meaning a person carrying real risk factors like high blood pressure or a higher body weight, but who is also physically fit, shows measurably better long-term outcomes than an unfit person without those same risk factors. I asked a cardiologist directly why this specific fact isn't more central to how health advice actually gets communicated, and her answer stuck with me. She said fitness is harder to sell, harder to package, and harder to measure casually than something like a diet or a specific food to avoid. You can put a warning label on a food. You can't easily put a warning label on a sedentary lifestyle, even though, according to her, and according to the research she spent her career studying, being unfit is arguably a more dangerous, more consequential health condition than most of the individual dietary villains that dominate public conversation. This led me to my second major correction, which was about a specific, quietly powerful idea called cardiorespiratory reserve, and how differently I now think about what in shape actually means. I used to assume being fit was mostly relevant to athletic performance, something that mattered if you wanted to run fast or lift heavy, but was somewhat cosmetic beyond that. What several researchers explained is that your cardiorespiratory fitness essentially represents a buffer, a reserve capacity your body can draw on during any period of physical stress, illness, surgery, or simply the ordinary demands of aging. Someone with a large reserve can absorb a serious illness, an infection, a major surgery, and recover with capacity to spare. Someone with very little reserve is operating close to their functional ceiling even during ordinary daily life, which means any additional stress, an illness, an injury, a hospital stay, can push them past a threshold from which recovery becomes considerably harder. One researcher described this using an image that stuck with me. She said, think of fitness not as a performance metric, but as the depth of the tank you're drawing from during every difficult moment life throws at you, physically. Most of us are unknowingly walking around with a nearly empty tank, and we don't find out how empty it actually is until we're forced to draw from it during an illness or an injury we didn't see coming. The third correction was about movement itself, separate from structured exercise entirely, and this genuinely surprised me. Several researchers describe something called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, sometimes shortened to NEAT, which refers to all the energy your body burns through ordinary daily movement that isn't deliberate exercise, walking around your home, standing rather than sitting, taking the stairs, fidgeting, the countless small movements most of us make unconsciously throughout the day. What surprised me is how much this quiet, background movement appears to matter for metabolic health, independent of whether someone also has a structured exercise routine. Several researchers pointed to studies showing that people who sit for the majority of their waking hours show meaningfully worse metabolic health markers than people who move frequently throughout the day, even when total structured exercise time is held constant between the two groups. In other words, an hour at the gym followed by 10 sedentary hours doesn't appear to fully offset the effect of those 10 sedentary hours, which was a genuinely uncomfortable thing to learn, because I'd spent years assuming my one dedicated workout was doing most of the heavy lifting, so to speak, regardless of how still I remained for the rest of the day. I want to bring in a fourth correction here that connects back to something I've talked about before, but that deserves its place in this specific reckoning: strength, and specifically how differently the research treats muscle compared to how casually most of us think about it. I used to think of muscle mass as relevant mainly to appearance or athletic performance. What the research actually shows is that muscle functions as a genuinely active, metabolically important tissue involved in blood sugar regulation, hormonal balance, and, according to a large and growing body of research, in overall resilience during illness and aging. Multiple large population studies have found that measures of muscular strength predict mortality risk independent of cardiovascular fitness, meaning strength and cardiorespiratory fitness appear to be capturing genuinely different, both important dimensions of your overall physical resilience, rather than one simply standing in for the other. I want to talk about why I think I had all of this backwards for so long, because I suspect the reasons apply to a lot of people watching this too. Diet is easier to discuss in specific, actionable terms. Eat this, avoid that, count this number. It fits neatly into headlines, into supplement marketing, into an entire industry built around telling people exactly what to put in their mouths. Fitness, movement, and strength are harder to package that way because the actual advice, move consistently, build strength, protect your cardiorespiratory capacity, doesn't sell a specific product nearly as easily as a specific diet or supplement does. Several researchers were candid that this commercial reality has quietly distorted public health messaging for decades, elevating diet to a position of primary importance that the underlying research doesn't fully support in isolation, while leaving fitness and movement chronically under-discussed, despite arguably stronger evidence behind their overall importance to long-term health outcomes. I remember a conversation with a longevity researcher that reframed how I think about this entire hierarchy. I asked her directly if she had to choose only one intervention to recommend to someone who wanted to maximize their years of healthy life and could only pick one, what would it be? She didn't hesitate. She said improving cardiorespiratory fitness, even modestly, in someone who is currently unfit, produces one of the largest, most consistent improvements in long-term mortality risk of any single intervention in all of medicine, more reliable, in her professional opinion, than most of the specific dietary interventions that dominate public conversation. She was careful to add that diet absolutely still matters, and she wasn't dismissing it. But she said if she had to rank the levers by the strength and consistency of the evidence behind them, movement, fitness, and strength would sit clearly above diet in her own personal hierarchy, which was, again, the exact opposite of the hierarchy I'd carried around for most of my adult life without ever seriously questioning it. I want to walk through what this actually looks like in practice, because I think the specific numbers involved are more encouraging than intimidating once you actually see them laid out. Several researchers were emphatic that the largest gains in health outcomes come from moving someone out of the least fit category into even a moderately fit one, not from turning an already reasonably active person into an elite athlete. In other words, the biggest, most consequential health returns exist at the bottom of the fitness spectrum, available to almost anyone willing to start, rather than requiring the kind of extreme training only a small fraction of the population will ever pursue. This reframed for me the entire idea of what getting healthy actually requires. It isn't about becoming exceptional. It's about escaping the specific, high-risk category of being sedentary, a much more achievable, much less intimidating threshold than the picture of fitness most of us carry around in our heads, usually borrowed from images of elite athletes rather than from the actual evidence about what meaningfully changes long-term health outcomes. I also want to mention something that came up repeatedly because it directly challenged an assumption I hadn't realized I was making. I used to assume that someone who was overweight but exercised regularly was still at meaningfully higher health risk than someone who was thin but sedentary, simply because I'd internalized weight itself as the primary marker of health. Several researchers push back on this directly, pointing to research suggesting that fitness level appears to be a stronger predictor of mortality risk than body weight alone, and that a fit person carrying additional body weight often shows better long-term health outcomes than an unfit person at a lower weight. I want to be careful here, because this doesn't mean weight is irrelevant, and several researchers were clear that weight and fitness both matter and interact with each other in complicated ways. But the specific idea that fitness itself may matter more than the number on the scale was a genuine correction to how I used to silently rank these two things in my head, usually without ever consciously examining the assumption at all. I want to bring all of these corrections together now, because I think there's a single unifying idea underneath everything I've described. We've built an entire culture of health advice heavily weighted toward diet, weight, and what you eat or avoid, while systematically under-discussing the evidence suggesting that physical capacity itself, your cardiorespiratory fitness, your strength, and even your ordinary daily movement outside of structured exercise may be a more powerful, more consistent predictor of how long and how well you actually live. That's not a minor footnote to the health conversation. Several researchers described it as one of the more significant blind spots in how health gets communicated to the general public, distorted less by the actual science and more by which interventions happen to be easiest to package, market, and sell. So let me try to turn all of this into something you can actually use, because I don't want to leave you with just a set of corrections and no clear direction. Here's what I've actually changed, and what I'd suggest considering yourself. First, if you had to pick one health metric to actually pay attention to and improve, let it be your cardiorespiratory fitness rather than a number on a scale. Simple, consistent aerobic activity, even in modest amounts, several sessions a week, produces some of the largest, most reliably documented improvements in long-term health outcomes of any single intervention available to you. Second, don't assume a single structured workout offsets a day spent almost entirely seated. Look for small, realistic ways to build more ordinary movement into your day, standing periodically, walking short distances rather than driving them, taking the stairs, since this background movement appears to matter for metabolic health independent of your formal exercise routine. Third, take strength training seriously as its own separate pillar, not as an optional add-on to cardio. The research suggests it protects against different things than cardiovascular fitness does, and both appear to matter independently for long-term resilience and mortality risk. Fourth, if you're currently in the least fit category and feel intimidated by the idea of getting in shape, understand that the biggest, most consequential health gains happen precisely at that starting point, moving from sedentary to even moderately active, not at the elite end of the fitness spectrum that most public fitness imagery tends to emphasize. Fifth, hold weight and fitness as two separate, both important considerations, rather than assuming weight alone tells the full story. A realistic, sustainable focus on becoming more physically capable, rather than purely on a number on a scale, appears, according to the evidence, to be at least as important, and by some measures more important, for your actual long-term health outcomes. I want to end with something the same longevity researcher said to me near the end of our conversation that has genuinely changed how I think about my own daily choices since. She said, "We've built a culture that treats health as something primarily controlled through restriction. What you don't eat, what you avoid, discipline, exercise mainly at the dinner table." She said the actual evidence tells a somewhat different and in some ways more hopeful story, that consistently moving your body, building and maintaining strength, and simply refusing to sit still for the majority of your waking hours may do more for how long and how well you live than almost any dietary restriction you could impose on yourself. I spent years thinking about health mostly in terms of what I denied myself. I've come to believe, after everything I've learned, that it might matter far more what I actually do with my body consistently for the rest of my life, starting today.